Welcome to TSAT. We are discussing about public finance. Okay, in simple terms, we are simply referring this as a fiscal policy, and I already defined this as fiscal policy is all about government's income spending. I mean income of the government of India and expenditure of government of India. Because as such, we happen to discuss that public finance is all about how government makes money, how government spends money, and if its spending exceeds its income, then how does government finances it? I mean, how does government borrows money and what amount of money government borrows? So income, expenditure and public debt together is what we happen to refer as public finance, and that's what we've been referring in the simple terms as fiscal policy. So in the previous session, I already has given introduction of what exactly fiscal policy or public finance is all about, and we discussed about the different sources of income to the government of India along with objectives of public finance and what are the types of fiscal policies, so expansionary policy, contractionary policy, the impact of both expansionary and contractionary policy. Okay, and then we started discussing about budget. Okay, so the best way of understanding fiscal policy is simply by going through the budget of the respective year, because that speaks a lot about the policy or the public finance. The entire public finance or fiscal policy simply could understand just going through the budget sheet of the respective year. So what is that as part of budget we will be trying to understand. So as such, I already made it clear that the three things that we must notice when it comes to the budget, the recent changes is railway budget has been merged with public budget, general budget, and then budget submission has been preponed from last working day of February to first working day of February, and we happen to forego this practice of segregating expenditure into plan and non-plan, and as of now we just go for segregating expenditure to just revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. And in the same process, we happen to also go through what exactly the government submits as part of budget. So along with estimates of budget, the government also submits finance bill and appropriation bill. And what does finance bill consist of? Appropriation bill consist of. And then coming to the budget sheet, the first part of budget sheet is what we are discussing is receipt side. So what are the different types of receipts of budget? We already made it clear that the receipts could be categorized into revenue receipts, what I call as a recurring or repeating, or capital receipts which are non-recurring, and I also happen to give you certain examples of both of them. Now let's try to go ahead with understanding the receipts in the current budget. So this is the budget of 22-23. So if you look at this particular pie chart, helps you understand where does rupee come from. I mean, out of every 1 rupee, what part of the receipts do contribute what proportion of the rupee. That's what we are trying to discuss. So where does rupee come from? How rupee comes from. So if you look at the major part of this happens to be, if you look at the biggest part of this pie happens to be borrowings and other liabilities, and if you look at out of every 1 rupee, 35 paise of what we mobilize happens to be coming from borrowings and other liabilities. Okay, and the next highest happens to be the GST, which is an indirect tax revenue. Then you could see a similar amount of value of 15 paise from corporation tax and income tax. So income tax is simply tax upon the individuals, and corporation tax is tax on the corporate profits. And then you have the union excise duties, the customs duties. So whenever you have customs duties, I mean to say both the export and import duties. Then you have other non-tax revenues. So I think you remember what exactly is a non-tax revenue. So anything that is recurring, let's say interest payments made by the states upon the loans borrowed, or simply dividends. Let's say the one best example is dividends received by the central government from the PSCs, public sector enterprises. Even that could be a best example of a non-tax revenue. And then 2 paise, approximately 2 paise happens to be coming from non-debt capital receipt. So what do you mean by non-debt capital receipt? You know what is a capital receipt? Anything that is capital receipt does mean that doesn't recur or doesn't repeat. Then what is non-debt? A capital receipt which is not resulting any liability upon the government of India. One simple example could be loans repaid by the states, or the other could be proceeds from disinvestment. That could be a finest example of a non-debt capital receipt. So don't get confused. The term seems to be complex, but simply non-debt creating receipt does mean, or non-debt receipt, whether it's a capital receipt or revenue receipt, or any receipt that doesn't result in creating any liability is what we call non-debt creating receipt. And here in this case, non-debt capital receipt does mean a non-recurring receipt which doesn't result in any liability to the government of India. So mostly when it comes to examination, what might be asked is which particular part of this pie happens to contribute what proportion of rupee, isn't it? Borrowings and other liability happens to be major source of receipts, and then next comes to the corporation tax, income tax, and then the GST. If you look at, that's going to be then contributes around 16 paise. So, and it's not necessary next year there is going to be same amount of money, but okay, to a large extent they more or less remain constant for a certain period of time. Okay, so that's what I just want you to notice. And going ahead with the next part of the budget. So, because any financial statement do consist of both the inflow and outflow. Okay, so when it comes to inflow, we discussed as part of receipts. Now let's try to understand as part of outflow. Outflow does mean anything that goes out of consolidated fund of India, out of consolidated fund of India, and that's that's what we call as an expenditure. And you remember, okay, the practice in India in good old days is that, okay, some 5-6 years prior, it used to be, the expenditure used to be segregated into plan and non-plan. Okay, that's what I'll just give you an idea about what exactly it is. But as of now, the practice is that the expenditure is simply segregated two different types of expenditures. One is revenue and capital. And you could apply the same logic that you applied for both, for receipts. When it comes to revenue and understanding the difference between revenue and capital, you could apply the same logic. Anything that repeats or recurs is what is called revenue expenditure. Anything that doesn't recur, any expenditure that doesn't recur. Let's say the salaries. Salaries is a perfect example of revenue expenditure. The subsidy bill of the government of India is a perfect example of revenue expenditure. The defense expenditure is a revenue expenditure. I mean, anything that happens to repeat with a certain time interval, okay, with a certain time period, could be best example. Or let's say the government of India happens to borrow money from the public, and upon the borrowings made, the government has to repay the interest. So the interest payments on the loans, okay, the interest payments on the loans borrowed by the center. Okay, and since this is a regular, okay, I mean, you're gonna pay it regularly on a monthly basis or on a weekly basis, fortnightly basis or a half-yearly basis, no matter whatever it is. When you borrow money with a commitment to pay a certain interest rate at a certain point of time, you are bound to pay it. All such kind of repeating expenditures is what we categorize as part of revenue expenditure. And what's a capital expenditure? Capital expenditure is any element of expenditure that results in creation of capital assets. Okay, to make things simple, let me give you a very simple idea. Imagine if this budget, the government happened to spend some 100 crores upon construction of a hospital. 100 crores on construction of a new hospital. And this 100 crores spent upon construction of a new hospital could be a best example of capital expenditure. But once the hospital has been built, from the next year, it is the responsibility of the government to spend some money on maintenance of that particular hospital constructed the previous year, isn't it? So that maintenance expenditure of the government is what we call revenue expenditure, because every year you need to spend some amount of money to pay the salaries, medicines, maintenance of hospital, electricity bills, isn't it? So whatever in general goes as an expenditure to maintain these assets, or that recurs with a certain time period, is what's called revenue expenditure. So if you construct a, university, build a university, lay a road, or simply construct an airport, seaport, any such kind of capital assets created, any amount of money spent to create such kind of capital assets, okay, is what we call capital expenditure. And once you happen to create these assets, it is obvious that you need to spend some money to maintain these assets, and such kind of recurring expenditure is what we call as a revenue expenditure. I guess you understood the difference between now the revenue and capital expenditure. Given an expenditure of government of India, you should be able to categorize whether it's a revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So having seen where does rupee come from, now let's go ahead and look into the current budget and where does rupee goes to. So out of every 1 rupee the government happen to spend, what proportion of rupee happens to go for what particular purpose? That's what we are trying to look at in this particular pie chart. Okay, and I think if you notice it, the major part of the pie happens to go to interest payments. Does mean the government might have borrowed a lot of money in the previous years, isn't it? Every year, the government happens to incur certain amount of fiscal deficits, and since years together the government happens to borrow money. Upon the borrowings, the government has been indebted to the public or simply to various other organizations, the government is liable to pay interest payments on the loans borrowed. And that interest payments on the loans borrowed do happen to constitute larger proportion of our spending, and that seems to be approximately 20 paise. So out of every rupee, 1 rupee the government is spending per year, 20 paise goes in the form of interest payments. And next, if you could look at it, state's share of taxes and duties. Okay, this is something I will be discussing when I discuss about Finance Commission. Okay, and in the next part of taxation we will be discussing about Finance Commission. So I think most of you been aware of the fact, not all the taxes, generally the fact that the central levies taxes in this country, state government levy taxes, even local government could also have a right to levy taxes, but not all the tax revenue collected in the center is what the center alone keeps it with itself or spends with itself. So certain proportion of money that it generates from the public has to be devolved, okay, it has to be shared with the states, and around 17 paise happens to go in the form of state share of taxes and duties. Okay, after interest payment, this happens to be the major part, and then you could see central sector schemes and central sponsor schemes. The very simple difference between central sector schemes and central sponsor schemes is when it comes to central schemes. Okay, not only the formulation of the scheme, even their total budget outlay for implement scheme is what is being taken care by the entire central government. And when it comes to central sponsor schemes, okay, the states do play a prominent role. There will be some matching grant from the states, and majority of the time these schemes are mostly implemented with the help of the state governments, and that's the reason we happen to. And there is also a further classification of these schemes like core schemes, core of the core schemes. That is something I will leave to you as an exercise. And then comes the other expenditures like pensions, finance commission transfer, subsidies, defense, and all these things. So this gives you a clear picture of where does rupee comes from, that's what we discussed, and where does rupee goes to. So how government spends its money from the concerned fund of India. Okay, so though the government, okay, as of now in the budget we don't have this kind of segregation in the form of planned and non-planned expenditure, but just let me throw you an idea of what exactly is this particular expenditure used to correspond to. So in good, okay, in those days when we used to have this kind of practice, the expenditures are again categorized, okay, broadly into planned and non-planned, and this particular planned and non-planned are again categorized based upon, okay, into revenue and capital expenditure. So let's say non-planned revenue expenditure, okay, so non-planned revenue expenditure, non-planned capital expenditure, planned revenue expenditure and planned capital expenditure. So let me give you certain examples so that you could understand the very basic purpose of aggregating into planned and non-planned. So very simple example, non-planned, an activity is not planned which you are bound to spend, because there is because certain expenditures, like see if you stay in a rented flat, you are bound to pay the rent. That is, okay, isn't it? There's nothing to plan. If you have employed some workers for your factory, it is your responsibility, no matter how your company performs, you are bound to pay the salaries to the people. Similarly, if the government makes a promise to the people, this is the goods I am subsidizing on a regular basis, you got to spend for it. You don't have any, okay, you don't have any other alternative. That's an obligation for you. Similarly, if the government happens to make a commitment to pay interest upon the loans borrowed, the government is bound to make it. So you don't need to plan for it. That is something you are bound to do. So such kind of expenditure generally what we refer as non-planned expenditures, and if that expenditures keep repeating, then we call it a non-planned revenue expenditure. One best example is interest payments on the loans borrowed. Interest payments on the loans borrowed, okay, interest payments on the loans borrowed, salaries, subsidies, defense expenditure, all of these, okay, could be best examples of non-planned revenue expenditure. And when it comes to non-planned capital expenditure, the best example is, okay, money spent upon contingency or any disaster relief, any disaster relief, let's say, okay, flood relief, because that's a non-planned activity. No one happened to anticipate this is something, this is what's going to happen. And this is not a regular expenditure or recurring expenditure, isn't it? There happens to be some exceptional event that happened, and hence for you need to address them by spending certain amount of money in the form of a flood relief or disaster relief. Okay, and coming to the planned capital expenditure, something that's a planned activity and a one-time expenditure, like see construction of a road, construction of a railroad, construction of a airport, seaport, hospital, that all happens to be referred as planned capital expenditure. And planned revenue expenditure, in India mostly the money that's been spent by the government of India, okay, for the sake of implementing various welfare schemes, social sector initiatives, okay, the state sponsor, okay, central sponsor schemes, all such initiatives, okay, whatever the government spends upon these kind of initiatives could be a better example of planned revenue expenditure, because the government, in order to achieve certain plan objectives, maybe for the sake of providing universal adult literacy, ensuring universal adult literacy, providing better amenities to all the people in this country, isn't it, with a certain plan. Okay, let's say we have various initiatives by GROUP-1 Yojana, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, we have Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. There are lot many initiatives by government of India in the name of promoting developmental activities, and any such kind of welfare expenditure the government happen to regularly spend on it to achieve a certain plan objective could be a better example of planned revenue expenditure. So as of now, we don't have this kind of segregation. I just want you to remember the fact that we happen to move this from this particular kind of okay, segregating expenditure to planned, non-planned to simply revenue and capital expenditure. Okay, but you should be able to figure it out. What's the very basic way of categorizing planned expenditure, non-planned expenditure, or revenue or capital expenditures. So having seen now, so we have seen both the receipt side of the budget. Okay, because a finance statement simply consists of receipts and expenditure, right? Okay, we have seen the receipt side of the budget, and we have seen the expenditure side of the budget. That means we have seen the inflow and we have seen the outflow. So ideally, any budget sheet, if you look at it, for any budget sheet, the total receipts would always be equal to total expenditure, because budget should always be a balanced statement. So total receipts should always be total expenditure. But I guess you remember the fact receipts include both income and borrowings. Receipts include both income and borrowings. Income and borrowings. So that being the reason, the total receipts in a budget would always be equal to total expenditure. It doesn't mean that income, okay, of the government of India is always equal to expenditure. Not necessary, isn't it? Because income plus borrowings together might be the total receipts, and that would be equal to the total expenditure. So now let's compare the income and expenditure. If the income of the government, I mean if the revenues or simply the income of the government is more than the expenditure the government happens to make, then the government is said to have a budget surplus, and the budget is said to be the government is said to have a surplus budget. That's a budget surplus. This is the situation. In general, when it comes to economy, if anything is a surplus, there is hardly any point in discussing about it, because if you have too much, how to spend that too much of money is not a big deal, big concern, isn't it? There's no point in debating and discussing about it, worrying about it. But if your income is less than your expenditure, if your income is less than your expenditure, in such case the problem is how to meet this excess expenditure, isn't it? And this particular shortage, okay, this particular shortage, whatever the shortage of income, okay, money that you are experiencing, because you are spending more than what you are earning, in such case the only solution that's been left is simply fill the gap, mostly through borrowings, isn't it? And this particular shortage of income the government experiences is what is generally referred as a deficit. Okay, so if you have more than what you spend, or if you receive more than what you spend, then you are said to have a surplus budget. If you are spending more than what you earn, then you are said to have a budget deficit. I mean your budget is said to have a deficit, shortfall. And there are 4 different types of deficit that we will be coming across any budget sheet, and let me go ahead and give you the meanings of each and every deficit, and also let me explain the consequences of these kind of deficits. So first and foremost kind of deficit that you will be coming across in a budget sheet is revenue deficit. And how would you measure the revenue deficit? It is simply the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipt. It's the revenue deficit. It shows the shortfall of government's current receipts or current expenditure, because as already made it clear that revenue is recurring, I mean the regular flow, isn't it? So let's say for a company, what is the revenue? The revenue is simply the money that it makes by selling the goods and services it produces. And what is the revenue expenditure of the company? The money it pays for the salaries, the money it pays for the current bill or electricity bill, what I mean to say, or the money it pays for the interest upon the loans borrowed. So the current expenses and the current income of a company is what we call revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. Similarly, for the government of India, whatever the receipts that you are regularly receiving, whatever the expenditure that you are regularly making. So if you compare, okay, and look at the gap between revenue expenditure and revenue receipts, okay, if your revenue expenditure is more than revenue receipts, in such case you are said to have a shortfall in revenue, and that particular shortfall is generally what we refer as a revenue receipts. Okay, revenue deficit. So it's simply the gap between your total revenue expenditure and total revenue receipts. Now the question is, having understood how to measure revenue deficit and what is revenue deficit, the question is it good or bad to have a revenue deficit? Now let me ask you a simple question. If your regular income is less than what you happen to spend on a regular basis, let's say there is a company which happen to receive less amount of money by selling goods and services than compared to the money it is spending upon the regular expenditure, that is salaries, and then the electricity bill, and then the internet bill, and then the other recurring expenditures, then is the company said to be in good shape or bad shape? So if you ask me, maybe in the initial days of setting up a company it might be good, but if the company keeps on running it by wherein a company happens to have more expenditure, regular expenditure, than compared to its regular revenue, in such case definitely the company seems to have a very serious problem. The same thing holds for the government of India. If the government's regular expenditure for the sake of salaries, subsidies, interest payments, maintenance of defense personnel, if it is having, okay, if the government is experiencing more such revenue expenditure than compared to its regular receipts in the form of taxes, then how should government has to fill the gap? It has to borrow. If the government borrows to fill this revenue deficit, that means what is the government doing with the money borrowed? It is simply spending to meet its current expenses. And since this money borrowed by the government of India to meet its current expenses, maybe for the sake of paying interest on the previous loans, maybe for the sake of subsidizing goods and services, maybe for the sake of paying salaries to the people of this country for this year, in such case, what do you think would be the problem? Is the money you are borrowing is not creating any asset to the government. if the money you borrow doesn't create any asset to the government, how do you think the government is going to pay it in the future? Because if your money borrowed is being spent for a current consumption and it doesn't create any asset, so the liability would be passed on to the next generations. I mean, the next generation kids has to end up paying the debt that we happen to rise to meet our current expenses. And that's the basic reason. Ideally, people end up simply saying it is bad to have a revenue deficit and it is always better to have a revenue surplus budget or a revenue neutral budget, because whenever you borrow money to meet your current expenses and these expenses doesn't create any assets, your ability to repay the loan would be really less and less, and henceforth you end up falling in a situation of a debt trap. Okay, so wherein you need to borrow money not only to meet your expenses, maybe you need to borrow money to repay your previous debts, and such situation miserably, okay, I mean it's going to be quite miserable for any government, and that's really going to result you or throw you into a debt trap. And that's a very basic reason people ideally suggest it is always better to have a revenue surplus budget or a revenue neutral budget. Now let's go ahead and look at the second type of a deficit that we do come across in the budget sheet. Okay, and how would you measure the fiscal deficit? Okay, fiscal deficit is simply the gap between total expenditure and total receipts. Total income. I'm really sorry. Total expenditure and total income. When I say total income, the same thing could also be written as total expenditure minus total non-debt creating. I mean any receipt that doesn't create a liability. Non-debt creating receipts. So if you look at the definition, when the government's non-borrowed receipt falls short of its entire expenditure, it has to borrow money from the public to meet the shortfall. The excess of total expenditure or total non-borrowed receipts is called fiscal deficit. So those statement or simply the definition seems to be complex, but simply remember the fact fiscal deficit is simply the gap between total expenditure and its total income, or simply it could be calculated by simply removing the component, that is total non-debt creating receipt of Government of India from its total expenditure. Whatever is the money the government obliged to borrow to meet the current expenses of this particular year is what will be called as fiscal deficit. So in a simple terms, fiscal deficit corresponds to the total borrowings. The government is expected to make this financial year. That's what's the this financial year. That's what the fiscal deficit corresponds to. Now let's go ahead and look at, is fiscal deficit good or bad? So in a very simple question, I am asking you, is borrowings good or bad? Is it good to borrow money? So whether it's for meeting its recurring expenses or non-recurring expenses, that's altogether a different question. But the question is, it is better to have a government having a fiscal deficit. So ideally people always have a perception borrowing is always bad, but you cannot outrightly end up simply saying borrowing is bad, or you cannot outrightly end up simply saying fiscal deficit is bad. Government or budget with fiscal deficit is bad. Your borrowing is only bad if you end up spending it for simply meeting an expenses which doesn't create any assets. But if you borrow money for the sake of construction of school, hospital, construction of railroad, or construction of a university, building a university, then definitely your borrowings do make sense, because they are simply resulting in creation of assets, and these assets created would help the current generation, future generation to reap certain amount of benefits out of these particular assets created, and henceforth that empowers the society. And there is nothing wrong in simply borrowing money for creating some capital assets or simply empowering your economy. But if you are borrowing just for the sake of paying interest on the loans borrowed previously, that doesn't make any sense. And henceforth you cannot outrightly end up simply saying fiscal deficit is bad. Or simply borrowing is bad. Borrowing makes sense only when you happen to make a judicious utilization out of it. When you make a proper usage out of it, definitely borrowing happens to make sense. But how much money to borrow? That's what always people suggest. There should be a limit upon the amount of money borrowed. Maybe your borrowing is for a good purpose, but at the end of the day, if you end up borrowing too much of money and you end up spending all that money in a span of 1 year, that spending of lot of money by government through borrowings might result in excessive expenditure of the Government of India. So if you borrow too much of money, all that borrowing results in huge amount of expenditure, and huge expenditure of Government of India results in a very high increase in demand, and that demand results in very high rise in prices, what we call it as simply the phenomenon of inflation. So high borrowings and spending by Government of India might result in very high inflation rates, and that's a very basic reason why people always suggest not only there happens to be a certain amount of fiscal deficits, but that fiscal deficit also has to be within reasonable limits. So it's not outrightly, you cannot outrightly end up simply saying fiscal deficit is bad. If you happen to have a purpose, okay, for which might result in creation of assets, definitely it's worth the borrowing, but that should always be within reasonable limits. As such, it is going to create inflation if it exceeds a certain limits. And the other major reason why people criticize high fiscal deficit and prolonged fiscal deficits is, imagine a scenario if the government itself is having an ambitious plan to spend a lot of money and ends up borrowing too much of money from the markets. And the government ends up borrowing too much money from the markets, and this too much of money borrowed from the markets floods the market for borrowings, isn't it? Now let's say if the government goes to the market and simply says, I alone want a lot of money for the sake of meeting my excess expenditure, so that might result in crowding out the markets. So if the government ends up borrowing too much money from markets, it leaves less amount of scope for private investors to borrow money, which might result in increase in cost of funds for the private investors. And this problem is what we call crowding out effect. And henceforth, it is always better to have a reasonable limit within when it comes to government borrowing. And that's the very basic reason you might be aware of the fact, okay, with the very basic purpose of what we call FRBM Act. Okay, just to impose certain reasonable restrictions on the government's abilities to borrow. And I guess you are already aware of the fact FRBM stands for Fiscal Responsibility Budgetary Management Act. Now let's look at the other important deficits. Somewhere from 2011-12, the budget, okay, so our previous finance minister, Pranab Mukherjee, has introduced this term effective revenue deficit. And how would you measure the effective revenue deficit? Effective revenue deficit is simply the revenue deficit minus grants allocated for creation of capital assets, So this is what's the effective revenue deficit, and this is how it is calculated. So very commonly referred to as GSEA. GSEA stands for grants allocated for creation of capital assets. So whatever the amount of money government spends, okay, allocates to the states or to various departments to create capital assets. If you remove the component from revenue deficit, what you get is effective revenue deficit. Okay, and now let's look at the last part of the deficits, that's a primary deficit. So how do you measure primary deficit? It is simply, okay, remove the gap, okay, from the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit, what does fiscal deficit corresponds to? The total borrowing the government is expected to make in a span of 1 year, isn't it? So if you remove the component of interest payments from the fiscal deficit, what you will be getting is what is called primary deficit. That's what is a primary deficit. So in this particular part of the session, as part of fiscal policy or public finance part 2, we happen to understand what are the various sources of receipts, what are the various ways the government spends money, where does government of India mobilize, how does government mobilizes rupee, what part of transaction do contribute large proportion to the inflow of the government of India, and how does government spends each and every penny, okay, out of every 1 rupee, which part of, what proportion of the rupee is spent for what purpose is what we have seen. And with the latest, okay, data from the current budget sheet itself, and then we started comparing the income and expenditure. And just keep it in mind that in any budget, for that matter, any financial statement, the left hand side, right hand side should always be equal. It should be balanced. And that being the reason, the total receipt should always be equal to total expenditure. But we are not comparing receipts with expenditure. I am just comparing income with expenditure. And if your income is more than your expenditure, then you are said to have a budget surplus. But if your income shortfall of your expenditure, then you are said to have a budget deficits. And in general, as of now, if you happen to regularly go through the budget of this particular, okay, we happen to submit, we do measure 4 different types of deficits. The first one is revenue deficit, which is the difference between your revenue expenditure and revenue receipts. And the second is fiscal deficit, which is the gap between total expenditure and total income. The third is the effective revenue deficit, which is the gap between revenue deficit and grants allocated for creation of capital assets. And the fourth one is primary deficit, which is the gap between fiscal deficit and interest payments. And in the coming session, we will try to understand how are these deficits financed and what would be the result of this and consequence of these deficits. And that's what we will be discussing as part of the next session, that is public finance part 3. Thank you.